let us hope that casino workers in Clark County, Nevada, and automobile workers in Wayne County, Michigan, will provide us, or have voted in sufficient number to have provided us some, at least temporary, respite from the nightmare of the past years. In the last lecture, I proposed some features of experiences between forgetting and memory within spaces where distinctions between the collapsed and the generative become matters of strategic decision, of alternations between running ahead and staying behind, of passionate engagement and calculated indifference. The rhythms of remembering to forget and forgetting to remember open up distinct horizons of perspective and action, while neither maneuver can replace or undo the other. For time is a matter of accompaniment, of never being alone within a singular present, of each place and moment being inhabited by lures and haunting. In the vast urban hinterlands, both seemingly depleted and spectacularly filled spaces simultaneously succumb to and resist gravitational pulls to dominant imaginaries of the good life, the effective or transcendent life. All of those imaginaries that the cities sought to materialize with their inevitable dark sides and dependence on cheap labor and cheap life. From tenement towns, suburban barrios, to jardin extensios, urban regions are now largely made up of built environments that look and feel like some kind of endless round, places to settle sleep and a few domestic functions, places full of interiors without definition, sales made and often withdrawn before any building is completed, or where buildings fall apart long before they can be paid off. It may appear that these surroundings are mere warehouses for an urban majority and the manifestations of a distributed system of residing, storing, fabricating, processing, extracting, and speculating that can take place out of view, out of having to consider and act on the political articulations among critical urban functions and populations. Yet the itineraries of movement and circulation that sometimes transpire among these distributions forge collectivities in motion that continuously rehearse different engagements that surrounds these surrounds as a kind of unanticipated accompaniment. In urban life characterized by intensifying dispossession and consumption, what are urban majorities, the poor, the working and lower middle classes, what are they left with? What do they, in the end, really have? Have not in the sense of property, assets, not that they can lay claim to, but more remains with them, in their midst, that which can be used now, but which does not entail a debt that can never be paid off. My friends Momen Al-Hussein and Caroline Quijato would argue that what such residents have is the maybe, that things maybe go one way or another in a moment that is singularly yours and yours alone, a moment where everything that has taken place so far does not generate the odds of a particular probability. All of the traumas of the past, everything that has been tried so far, whether it works or not, all of the times where one has fallen down to pick oneself up again, does not prepare you for what will take place now. All of that suffering that won't be redeemed, but which has thickened your skin, turned the surface of the body into a confusing map of contradictory itineraries. All of this both comes to matter and won't matter on whether you pass through the roadblock, manage to mobilize a life savings into something tangible, manage to turn that corner just before the police or debt collectors arrive. This time of the maybe, more than simply a wager or speculation, is a continuous rebellion against what is on offer, against how one is regarded, but it is a rebellion without redemption. All of that suffering and labor, all of those struggles, Lord, perhaps in the end do produce a definitive destination that makes it all worth it. If you have managed to break on through to some other side, it is as if the accomplishment is yours and yours alone. But the sense of the maybe I make it or maybe I don't, is not up to you, is not a reflection of your skill or worthiness. Rather, what you possess at the end of the day is an accompaniment. Something else is there besides you, something you possess that possesses you. A situation where you are tethered to a mind of its own that is also yours. Your possessions in the end are the possibilities of being possessed in a rebellion against what you think you are at that moment, when a line in the sand or on a road or a screen is drawn. For when you appear at that roadblock, at that crossroads, it's not your history, your eligibility, your skill that will see you through. Everything you present at that moment may count for nothing in a decision that is completely arbitrary and for which you will have no grounds for appeal. At the same time, all of the times when you might be deemed ineligible to show up at that roadblock, that courthouse, that convocation, where those who judge claim that you are just not good enough, just not sufficiently prepared, also, in the end, doesn't matter. You don't give them any mind, and that too is part of the maybe. It is a situation where no matter what you have doesn't count, and where all that you don't have also is refused count. On the one hand, you can be dismissed for no reason. On the other, dismissal is not a reason for anything. You will carry on no matter what. Each trajectory accompanies each other. Each is a matter of mutual possession. That which is present, accounted for, presented, and performed is dismissed, just as the grounds for dismissal are irrelevant in an adamant claim for endurance. This then is what residents are left with. This is what they have. In the past recent decades, much has been said about the kind of ways the human should or should not be retained as a concept. What is the human's culpability as a species or political entity in the possible extinction of its own ongoingness? How has the human been used to reduce large swathes of human life to the status of the inhuman? Without entering into these debates per se, my intent is simply to raise the question of accompaniment to whatever journey the human has made. Not dissimilar to Donna Haraway's notions of companion species, what kind of companions might we have? Here I want to dig into the traditions of popular Islamic histories to pose the possibilities of jinn as one way of thinking about the surrounds. Jinn as companions, who are never one thing, but always a shape-shifting concrescence of different forces and images that concretize a specific dilemma or possibility, a roadblock, a courthouse, a city hall. Jinns may be identified with particular names or features in an act of figuring that simultaneously brings together tensions in a living enactment, while embodying the reality that any agency is a composite agency all the way down. Whatever individual decisiveness, integrity, or self-conscious reflection we may possess is accompanied, exposed to a technological mode of existence, which is what jinn basically is. Based on the single element of fire, that which was stolen from the gods, jinn is technical all the way down in its capacity to convert, remake, transmute, and transform without any overarching objective or political purpose. Its operations are not guaranteed by any essential harmonization. Always shaped by a gap of synchronization, jinn is incessant socio-political antagonism, the possibility of rebellion without end. And it is this possibility of rebellion, of upending any definition of purpose or redemption, that is the accompaniment of the human. Mohsin Alayari is an Iranian-American artist who has attempted to recuperate the voluminous stories of jinn across different Islamic cultures in what she calls a time of women. She produces 3D printed female jinn figures in a project entitled She Who Sees the Unknown. These refigurings draw from the various ways in which female jinn are cited in the Quran, seek to specifically embody a time of women at work in contemporary renditions of colonialism, climate change, and racial and gender injustice. Jinn, as a locus of hybridization, is deployed to exert specific forces of life. So I'm interested in jinn not so much as a distinct kind of entity, but as an entitling of force that compels a particular way of paying attention to the world, of responding to calls potentially issued by everything and everywhere. Huma, with its 3 heads, 2 facing in opposite directions, and a third upward into the future, with legs splayed, is the transmission of heat for those who have been left behind, a medium through which their forgotten presence makes itself felt. Here, technology becomes an instrument of justice, and where what is institutionalized as well-being becomes a desert, something to be deserted. If there is to be any redemption, there can only be redemption for all. There is no eligibility, no hierarchy, or property. Aisha Kandisha is she who can crack, open up, unlock, render that which is most secure vulnerable, identify the holes in any policy or dictate. In such dehiscence, there can be no resuturing, no new skin to cover the wound. The only way to survive is to participate in the exposure that is availed, to live outside the terms through which one has recognized themselves as complete or integral. Yauj Majuj has traditionally been figured as the instigator of chaos. With its multiple heads protruding from a reptile body, she is the purveyor of fitna, which underlines the definition of every social body. She is the precipitant of sovereignty, the elemental distinguishing friend and enemy, compelling walls to be built, but within which her face cannot hold. For she insists upon her accompaniment of every social order, and is that which polity cannot do without. Alayari's final figure, the laughing snake, is a female serpent who winds her way haphazardly across every city in any direction, devouring all that she confronts. The only way to stop her is for men to hold a mirror in front of her. And in encountering her image, she literally after many days dies laughing. Rather than being alarmed, enchanted, or alienated by her representation, the serpent simply convulses with the hilarity that somehow representation could at all be adequate to the reality at hand. How she is understood is so wildly incongruous to her own conception of herself that she finds the situation nearly impossible to grasp. How stupid are men to think that somehow institutionalizing a confrontation with the image would be capable of doing anything. For this is an act only paradoxically effective because the excessive hilarity it provokes makes the serpent forget that she needs to eat. Each of these jinn, then, are neither curses, prophecies, nor willing co-conspirators to human desires to inflict harm. Neither are they cures. As the Quran makes clear, jinns are capable of both obedience and disobedience to divine will. They are rather technical operations, openers, heat inducers, shapeshifters, navigational instruments, disruptors, and thresholds, potentially used for radically different purposes, all of which are unable to contain them. For Muslim popular cultures, they extend the time of women from that of caring, reproducing, seducing, dissimulating, birthing, and gossiping to fundamentally industrial actions, responsible for ensuring the possibilities of endurance where there seemingly may be none. In the last lecture, I talked briefly about past engagements with Bloods gangs in Kinshasa. I cited how 51, a Bloods gang member overseeing an international tribunal, talked about the imminence of a time of women that was coming in the possible evacuation of the city. An evacuation that would be forgotten so that the same conditions might be re-inhabited in different ways, where the urban core would be approached as an urban surrounds. In Jean-Pierre Beccolo's 2005 film, Les Saignants, The Bloods, this time of women is demonstrated in the way in which Majuli and her friend Chuchu must overturn the political power structure in order for them simply to live as they are, two youth who perhaps have an entire life ahead of them. Like many young women in their circumstances, Cameroon in 2024, when the film story takes place, does not look any different from Cameroon's present at that time. Both women attempt to gain access to economic possibilities through sexual encounters with the elite. They not only make their bodies available to be used by men, but enact the sexual with such extraordinary choreographies so as to make it inevitable that the men will submit to their subsequent requests, reiterating the age-old stereotype of women as the real sexual predators. At the film's opening, however, the head of security that Majuli has fucked suddenly dies, forcing her to quickly come up with a plan for disposing the body. She turns to her friend Chuchu for help, and implicitly to Chuchu's mother, the woman closest to her who knows the rights of the jinn, Mavungu, who must inevitably accompany the young women on this mission to save themselves. In Betty culture, Mavungo embodies the empowerment of women necessary to combat forces that cause misfortune, such as failed harvests or unexplained death. It entails nocturnal gatherings where women spend the night singing, eating, and celebrating the clitoris of Mavungo, said to be more powerful than any phallus. In Beccolo's film, Mavungu becomes a mobile embodiment of multiple pasts that could have been, a thoroughly technological force, neither intrinsically virtuous nor destructive. It is neither living nor non-living, but rather an intersection of countervailing forces that could go in many different directions, that is the source of rebellion against any hegemonic narrative, and that gathers up all of the residues of interactions that are constrained and shaped by specific political orders, and offers different arrangements and different dispositions. At first acting from their perceived vulnerability, the young women dispose of the victim's body with a local butcher, placing wads of cash in his hand, who takes everything but the head. Soon they recall, however, that the most important occasion, particularly in terms of political elevation, is that of wakes for important people, where the political class gathers to perform exaggerated acts of mourning, and quickly figure ways to reposition themselves around the nascent absence. Additionally, in a city where sexual violence is always to be expected, throwing oneself over the casketed body of the deceased is one relatively safe place for prostrate women not to be threatened with rape. Having snuck into one of the wakes in order to drink and eat for free, and having spent their available money on taxis and butchers, Majuli decides to stage a wake for the chief of security that had passed away during her extraordinary sexual acrobatics. But for this, she and Chuchu will need to find a body to accompany the head, and much of the film centers on this quest and the unfolding relationship with the Minister of State forced upon them in this. The film ends with the women seducing, fighting, and killing the Minister of State to save one of their friends from being raped. During the entire film, even the investigations of the non-corrupt police, even investigations by the non-corrupt police are rendered completely useless. Beccolo indeed intersperses the narrative with cuts where he poses the questions such as, what does it mean to tell a detective story in a country where everything is denied? Even as the jinn Mvungu provides the surfeit of force necessary to destroy the Minister of State, his dead body is full of potentially lethal toxins, which the young women must remove all traces of in order for them to survive. The film, having taken place entirely at night, closes during daylight as Majuli and Chuchu are seen happily wandering among the populace in a local market, living an ordinary life, otherwise deemed impossible without their protracted rebellion. Here, the very possibility of two young women accompanying each other is predicated on drawing upon the surrounds of a well-known companion, Mvungu, but whose character, disposition, and potentiality in the present cannot be known in detail based on that familiarity. As such, this is not a force that can be controlled. It can be called upon, but with complete uncertainty as to how things are going to turn out. There is simply no way of knowing. For rebellion cannot show the same old cards. It cannot give itself away in advance. It is again a time of the maybe. At other times, rebellion and accompaniment are rendered more tacit within the daily operations of collective life. Rebellion can be inscribed into the very materiality of how people live together. Rumasusun Tanatingi is a large social housing development built 22 years ago that now accommodates some 4,000 residents in 8 four-story concrete structures, each unit measuring from 35 to 50 square meters. Over the years, residents have sometimes extended and enclosed balconies, redesigned the external facades of their interior entries, constructed elaborate pulley systems and external bamboo frames for increasing the space available for laundry and transferring small items across apartment units. The ground floor entrances have been extended by a constantly redesigned network of sheds, lean-tos, and canopies for small commercial activities and meeting places. The unusual voluminous hallways that traverse the complex are replete not only with various stored items, but the compositions of various projects, from bird cages, herbal medicine, card games, maker spaces with their collection of discarded equipment, Photoshop backgrounds for TikTok videos churned out by young kids, small looms for weaving, tape recorders, ducks, improvised kitchen for culinary snack production, all of which are in violation of the rules. Passageways not only accommodate bodily traffic, but propositions about spatial possibilities, about what could be done, without effort to consolidate space or institutionalize a niche as discrepant things and activities seem to work their way through and around each other. Instead of demanding right of way, unimpeded access from one style to a larger external world. The challenge, rather, is what can be done with the incessantly strange assortment of propositions that refuse consensus, that don't so much demand to be acknowledged as to slip into still other propositions and temporary assemblages. Far from being a preference for chaos, these propositions, this intermingling of things and their proponents, is a lure for residents to reconsider their orientations to present conditions, a renewal of the affective atmosphere of a complex clearly heaving its way in attempts to accommodate the sheer numbers, for the elders with limited mobility and the young that are unable to stay put. The critical element of this construction is that any emplacement residence projects resonates with multiple lines of connection, that every project and proposition does not provoke excessive antagonism or feelings of vulnerability, that it doesn't extract space for its own profit. Such had been a matter of concern in the now torn down shacks inserted into back alleyways that were often used for drug sales. Tensions do exist between the reasonable aspiration that many residents have to carve out as much as a normal life as they can in terms of well-managed households governed in conjunction with similar others, and the recognition that Tanatingi itself has long capitalized on its reputation as the Black Heart of Jakarta, full of unruly, undomesticated characters plying licit and illicit trades in ways that make the difference between them indiscernible. This is a district rooted in the generativity of the maybe, the intensive mixtures of functional and dysfunctional materials, brazen commentary and outrageous claims, and work playfully across long hours will bring to life something unanticipated and transformative. For such eventuality to work, nothing could be imposed for sure. Rumah Susun Tanatingi has indeed been the site of many attempted impositions. Competing drug gangs, political parties, religious groupings, brokers, commercial bosses, and hungry bureaucrats always try to imprint their agendas on the place through cajoling, luring, promising, providing, or forcefully imposing their will, sowing distrust, forging complicities. While such agendas may sometimes win the day, over the years it has not been for long. And impositions don't set in for protracted periods of time, not with the webs of intensely local and changing propositions materialized through the interconnections of space, along hallways, yards, rooftops, entryways, parking lots, and other common spaces. Not with a growing array of objects circulating across disparate endeavors, as well as the intercalated choreographies of cooking and washing and cleaning and repairing, praying, joking, arguing, and so forth, with our own tapestries of effective register. There is what Laura Kemmer has called a domain of material resistance that goes beyond the familiar tropes of political agency. Resistance is in the very arrangement of materials in space, the propositions that ensue from these arrangements of what could be done, the way these propositions are incorporated into others and mapped onto the shifting social interdependencies of residents that refuse to be resettled into dispositions that promise either betterment, rectification, or redemption. Such resistance maintains the possibility of eventuality, of the maybe, where the ongoing intersection of different approaches and outcomes of common residents might proceed to generate experiences that are easily codified or structured by those of the past, that engender new collective capacities on endurance. Material resistance indicates a surfeit of effective charge in residents' relationships with their immediate environment, and generates a surrounds as the Ruma Susa is literally surrounded with the incipient propositions that emerge through their various efforts to curate the different spaces across the complex. Like all manifestations of resistance, there is nothing unequivocally generative or virtuous. While the material resistance conveyed through the process of continuous rearrangement and updating may clear a path for unanticipated feelings, initiatives, and capacities, residents may also be inclined to hold on too long to their attachments, either in their compulsion to revise or let things be, to a specific version of themselves that they come to be known for or invest in. The force of eventuality is that its dispositions remain unknown. There can be speculation, prediction, and probability. But when actions are undertaken specifically to anticipate something new coming to the fore, certain disappointment will inevitably ensue. Eventuality cannot adhere to the same logics as planning. There may be faith in the pursuit of particular tacit collective processes, but whether they will produce anything useful or not, usable or not, remains a question. For it is just this question which is operationalized by material resistance, that temporality where nothing, something, or everything might happen. For disappointment registers as a decay in the energies of residents, their susceptibility to grand narratives of conspiracies and promised salvation. Material residence is something that requires continuous tending and curiosity, not as a receptacle for the deepest hopes of individuals, households, or communities, but rather a step aside daily routine, an engagement with a shape-shifting entity that spawns the complex and embodies the traces of past that might have led in different directions, a co-residence with jinn, a technicity of souls. The everyday acts of proposing, materialized in small endeavors, and their compositional objects, are forms of address calling upon the attentiveness of others. This call is not to say, hey, look at me, here I am, this is mine, this represents me, but rather the sense of take me up, somehow, call upon me, fold me in, but at the same time, let me be. This mode of address seeks intimacy with an aggregation of different forces at work in the complex. This is done not with the intent of channeling to do harm or advance individual interest, but to maintain an element of enhancement, uncanny wonder within the routinized mechanization, which are necessary to keep 900 households in such close proximity living on. The refusal of redemption is exemplified in Jean Genet's incendiary final dramatic work, The Screams, written during the midst of the Algerian War. Here the most wretched of characters, the Arabs, are surrounded by complete indifference to their existence and the opportunistic efforts to capitalize on their desperation for recognition as they are assigned the dirty jobs of effacing the scourge of French colonialism. They are surrounded by maternal invocations to completely debase themselves, amplify the very wretchedness that they represent. The play staged is a series of screens situated at various levels across the expansive stage. The projections of French modernity are literally figured as projectiles against the possibilities of any self-determination, of any effort to recognize life emerging behind the screens. Political discourse of any kind remains a freak show, full of inflated claims and cartoon identities. The combatants for liberation end up parodying the very forms of entrapment they seek to overturn, seemingly indifferent to their elevating the inauthentic sentiments of freedom and democracy the enemy have long ceased to believe in anyway. The French simply want to wallow in blood and will use any civilized excuse to do so. When they go high, there is nowhere else for the wretched to go but lower than low. For only then, in a life of continuous revolt, exhausting all of the proposals for rectification on offer, will the path be cleared for the wretched to gather each other up in equanimity and mutual respect simply for what they are. The time of women for Genet is not that of upliftment, but a refusal to be dignified for revolutionary fervor or tenderness exhibited toward the cause. In the confrontation between Pierre, a French parachutist, and the mother, the embodiment of the call for utter debasement, now armed, Pierre, with anxiety, says, "Granny, you playing a game or something? You're too old for that. What are you doing?" And the mother, suddenly out of patience, vigorously pulls the strap, pressing her knee against the soldier's back. "I'm pulling." And she imitates the sound of a machine gun, then spits in her hands and pulls harder. With sudden panic, Pierre exclaims, "It's not possible. You haven't done that, have you, you old girl?" She gives the corpse a kick. "It's not true. You're not dead. Stand up, on your feet. You're not dead. I didn't kill you, did I?" She kneels beside the corpse. "Answer me. I beg you, answer, little soldier of France. Love, my pussycat, my little mousie. Stand up. Come on, up, you trash." She straightens and picks up the belt. "He's dead all right, the swine." Even here, any act of courage is accidental, unintended, but it doesn't matter. The real worry for the wretched in this play is that the liberators will name public squares after them, freeze them into someone else's memory. Thus, betrayal is the only way out. For Said, the closest the play comes to a main character, to be a thief is to be despised by everyone. But this is the only way to avoid becoming an object of theft. Revolutions cannot be successfully waged without thieves, without those willing to overstep the bounds, to commit acts that can be immediately condemned by all sides. Yet the thieves, the wretched, may indeed refuse to have anything to do with that which is brought about by their good works. They betray the possibility of their own redemption, preferring to remain wild cards potentially associated with any endeavor, which they will continue to portray and exhaust until all that is left are themselves just on the outskirts of the city, just on the outskirts of the wreckage that is their own creation, all of the things in disarray to be rearranged without plan or purpose. Maybe it will work, maybe it will not. Any chance to change the course of the world must come to grips with the possibility that there is no redemption. Perhaps the only thing that can be done is to turn away from the inevitability of repetition, of the way individuals are continuously lured into thinking that behind the veil, under the floorboards, rests buried truth, buried treasure. Perhaps no writer has come as close to this possibility as Fernanda Melchor in her recent novel, Hurricane Season. The book is set in one of those urban hinterlands, in this case, La Matosa, some 15 miles from the official border of Veracruz, Mexico, a place of passing through, truck stops, cheap bars and brothels, roadside stands, checkpoints, set amidst a landscape of largely fallow sugar cane, dyeing factories, and oil fields. The story centers on the killing of a witch, imbued with every conceivable fantasy and derogation, and who actually is a trans, living in a hut in the irrigation canals, who practices traditional medicine and throws wild clandestine parties. She is constantly visited by the lovelorn, the sick and aspirant, all seeking visions and cures, even as she is vilified by all. La Montosa is a world inhabited by the perpetually wounded. Every relation seems characterized by a nauseating mixture of desire, disgust, cruelty, and betrayal. Any act of tenderness is immediately undermined. Every sexual act a medium through which the most despicable and desirable become indiscernible. Young girls slaughtered for fun by narcs end up as taco filling. Grandmothers and mothers willingly abandon their children to any fate that provides a momentary meal or fuck. Betrayal of loved ones becomes inseparable from any feeling of tenderness. Young men constantly humiliate each other as the only available form of solidarity, with the exception of sucking any cock that comes along willing to pay for it. It is a world that never seems to exhaust its own wretchedness, where everyone blames everyone else for their misfortune. Melchior conveys this world with the most proficient and propulsive of run-on sentences that never seem to run out of breath, but rather capture our desire that somehow in all of the muck and madness, there is a route out of this implosive maze, but it never comes. No matter how determined the inhabitants may be to escape, either through suicide or jobs elsewhere, they are trapped by their toxic dependencies, their inability to separate out all of the conflicting emotions, so that they might be decisive somehow and somewhere. They are unable to relent on the fantasy they know well not to be true, that under the witch's house there is enormous amounts of gold to be found. But it wasn't even for this that the witch had her throat cut in a canal, but rather from an intent simply banal. All that seems possible is from that time of women who, while betraying and bad-mouthing each other, nevertheless recognize that there is something else that accompanies their perpetual cruelty. And I quote from Melchior, "They say the place is hot, that it won't be long before they send in the Marines to restore order in the region. They say the heat's driven the locals crazy, that it's not normal, May, and not a single drop of rain, and that the hurricane season's coming hard, that it must be bad vibes, jinxes causing all that bleakness. Decapitated bodies, maimed bodies, rolled up, bagged up bodies dumped on the roadside or in hastily dug graves on the outskirts of town. Men killed in shootouts and car crashes and revenge killings between rival clans, rapes, suicides, crimes of passions, as the journalists call them. Like that 12-year-old kid who killed his girlfriend in a jealous rage on discovering that she was pregnant with his father's baby down in San Pedro Patrillo. They say that's why the women are on edge, especially in La Matosa. They say that come evening, they gather on their porches to smoke filterless cigarettes and cradle their youngest babes in their arms, blowing their peppery breath over those tender crowds to shoo away the mosquitoes, basking in what little breeze reaches them from the river. When at last sound settles into silence and you can just about make out the music coming from the highway brothels in the distance, the rumble of the trucks as they make their way to the oil fields, the baying of dogs calling each other like wolves from one side of the plain or the other, the time of evening when the women sit around telling stories with one eye on the sky, looking out for that strange white bird that perches on the tallest of trees and watches them with a look that seems to want to tell them something, that there is no treasure there, no gold or silver or diamonds or anything more than a searing pain that refuses to go away." Here, jinn appear in the most stripped down way, that of a white bird, seeming to tell the residents of La Matosa to turn away from the prospects that the witch, whom they defiled, despised, and then killed, holds out the prospect of any fortune. Whether they pay attention or not is another matter. What to make of these reflections on rebellion without redemption? My claim would be that they are rehearsals for a militant sensibility that takes the world, this world, head on, that takes it on by taking it in and being within it in an extensive manner, undaunted by the contradictions or sheer brutality. The notion of taking it on by multiplying the angles through which we take it in does not mean that we come to understand it any better or are able to bend it to emancipative strivings or the conviction that now everything might be changed. Rather, it is a stance aimed at overcoming whatever reticence we might have in deploying the technical tools at our disposal even as we necessarily must remain wary of their untoward implications. The profusion of algorithmic calculability will continue unabated, dispersed across more and more aspects of daily life. Concomitantly, personal data continues to be consolidated as the predominant currency, enabling a more proficient targeting of rule and population control. Methodologies of detection are more attuned to the finer gradations of life generated by these methodologies themselves. But as Luciana Parisi points out, programmatic calculation is not simply the execution of instructions, but a machine ecology thoroughly inflected with randomness. As such, digital infrastructures potentiate unapprehendable scenarios not easily subsumed to the dictates of techno-capitalism, yet almost always adaptable to them. As soon as actualities come together, as soon as supposedly discrete events and objects feel each other out, are placed in some kind of relation with each other, are assessed in terms of their impact on each other or their respective genealogies of appearance, no matter how prescriptive or limiting their interactions might be, they always suggest a potential of what might have taken place, of non-denumerable dispositions. This does not mean that the view onto the world is some uninterrupted, smooth and networked space. Frictions, borders, blind spots, and partiality abound. But what is frictional, bordered, or transitional becomes increasingly uncertain. Getting in or being left out, of moving from here to there, may remain substantive empirical experiences. But where we may appear, to whom, what we have access to under certain circumstances, or what side we may occupy in multiple antagonisms, makes any assessment of our overall position less clear. This does not only entail the familiar processes of hacking or stealth, but in the strange duplicities that might ensue from the now normative reference to network sociality. This is as evident in subaltern as it is in multicultural domains. I recall stories from Khartoum when sandstorms called haboob would often overwhelm the city, turning the sky completely dark at midday, inundating the atmosphere with the finest grained particles that even layer upon layer of covering would be hard pressed to keep out. Following the haboob, police records would document the massive report of thefts from houses, such as the complete disappearance of furnishings and automobiles that suddenly disappear, leaving no trace. Some households were reluctant to talk about these occurrences, fearing that adverse judgments will be made about their moral stature or sanity. Others were overeager to spill the beans, claiming that they had lost everything. For many residents in Khartoum's upscale neighborhoods had used all of their resources simply to purchase land and build large edifices in high-status areas, and would have nothing left with which to populate the interiors. Attributions of such theft could easily be viewed as an excuse for having built beyond one's means. Yet in Hajj Yusuf and Mayo and Umbada, the predominant areas of Dinka, Nuer, Shilluk, and Nuba residency in the city, there is a precise recounting of these disappearances. Waybills are soon displayed about how the loot is already on lorries heading towards South Sudan, and maps are drawn to outline the best ways to avoid police roadblocks. Large numbers of residents in these neighborhoods seem to be in possession of the most intimate details concerning the households that have been appropriated, as if they had been the objects of stakeouts for long periods of time. Verification of these claims is of course shrouded in ambiguity, as it is only possible to anecdotally confirm the truth of these situations. The only official documentation rests with the police records, but this is not the point. For the appearance of wins, grand theft, extensive distributed knowledge of details, and the coordination of the discussions reveal a collectivity without specific form, yet a tangible intervention into the sea, a momentary reversal of powers, a reversal that is largely simply blamed on the wind. What is this attribution of capacity to the physical force of the wind that purportedly enables a collective activation of force amongst the most marginal of Khartoum's residents? What is this performance of a nearly encyclopedic knowledge of the city's spatial composition and a multitude of itineraries that traverse it? Can it be considered a platform of algorithmic operations? What is this mutual possession of collective capacity and a calculative figuring? This way in which a collectivity that cannot be proven to exist hacks into the transversal operation of the city, upends its certainties of property, and produces the possibility that somehow the oppressed are simply biding their time, holding on to a critical capacity to which the elite are both haunted by and completely indebted to. The irony of our prevalent relationship to the technical and technical operations is that we work them in order to figure what we think might constitute a deeply felt expression of who we are, that somehow they can be made to represent more precisely the singularity of our positions and sentiments. Yet why do we think that such technicities have anything fundamental to do with us? Why do we think that they have to be grounded in our own meanings, where it is their very existence and exteriority that makes them useful as a way of touching upon things without our perceptions and orientation? When Instagram throws our images and words across an unmonitorable expanse of views and situations, any stability of the performing self is unsettled. Similarly, the aggregation of our personal details could care less about who we are and what we want to be. Algorithms are only interested in our behavior, and our identity is functional only as a shifting filing system. As Sean Cubitt reminds us, network subjectivity converts individual persons into conduits of variegated mediatic flows and corporeal responses whose dispositions are held in reserve by data conglomerates to be put to work in redirecting the compositions, intensities, and speeds of subsequent flows. In face of a permanent dissatisfaction generated by a never-ending appropriation of affect and creativity, the possibilities of self-articulation rest with the proliferation of the hypothetical, of what well we might be right now in terms of unfolding events and capacities. Here, the authentic, the truly felt and embodied, the fantasy of liberation is displaced by all kinds of scenarios and simultaneously self-affecting and self-effacing maneuvers that disrupt any equivalence between a proper identity and proper behavior. Things can touch each other in unprecedented ways, and the process of counting can open up unanticipated uses of these things. As I emphasized in the first lecture, how many spaces across urban regions are underused, vacated, provisionally occupied, and in how many ways could their dormancy be repurposed in providing even temporary platforms for the intersections of different activities and the things and resources they have access to? Or take the long existing working class districts of central Jakarta, characterized by the intricate cultivation of territories of operation for heterogeneously composed households and their footholds in different complementary forms of local work. This work includes the collaborative making of the local built environment, itself largely embodied as a non-proprietary orientation to the generation and use of resources. Here, transit entailed the continuous circulation of people and things through various uses, occupations, and positions. But these districts now face a host of serious challenges. These include inflated land valuation, cheap imports, changing cultural values, and monopoly capture of local production systems. But through the development of very low-cost applications that amasses back-end data about the hundreds of workshops, the thousands of machines, skill levels of workers, and modalities and skills of distribution chains within specific districts, an expansive notion of inventory for everyday users is created. Such an inventory potentiates a wide range of collective entrepreneurial operations capable of renewing the economic elasticity and vitality of these districts. These operations coincide with attempts to secure neighborhood-based accords of resource distribution and accountability that attempt to make sense of the aggregated effects of plural data streams. While such local economies remain intensely vulnerable to the whims of global financial maneuvers, they also reflect provisional ways in which continuous hacking into the tools of control society maybe constitute a means to keep going, to hold on to the trappings of long-honed collective lives. I just referred to the material resistances of a social housing project in Jakarta that concretizes an ongoing sense of propositions for coordinated actions that extend in all kinds of directions based on the very arrangements of things in space that also structure the ways in which everything circulates in this context. Before the pandemic set in, I was pursuing tentative explorations of so-called underground railroads in Europe, ways in which banal urban landscapes were being repurposed to house the variegated needs and aspirations of sans-papier African residents. In another massive social housing project in a European urban location that will remain unnamed, rebellion is expressed in the construction of a built environment that, on the one hand, resonates with the Black Dadaist assemblages of Noah Purifoy in the California desert, and the weirdly constructed village of Kenya in Guinea, home of Sekou Touré's longtime Marabout, where deciphering what was home, mosque, market, animal pen, vegetable garden was almost impossible. In this European suburb, residents, without discernible forms of deliberation or planning, have managed to convert much of the interior of a 20-story apartment block of 400 units that was rapidly being vacated into a melange of work studios, media centers, boxing rings, communal domestic and commercial kitchens, artisanal factories, and computer banks, all that crisscross each other in a nearly chaotic fashion. Each function intrudes upon the other while according sufficient space to enable specific jobs to be done by specific people who nevertheless find themselves accompanied by disparate actors and activities in conjunctions that may initially appear to be absurd, but over time seem to ward off the kinds of consolidations of turf and propriety that often interrupt such collective projects. All of this has been done while maintaining a facade of complete normalcy, the dissimulated image of another problematic estate riven by racial marginality and religious extremism. Years spent effectively keeping the police out and conducting social work at a designated community center were finally parlayed, according to one resident, Fatima, into something she deems simply as useful. Here, the specificity of what is constructed is intensely specific. It is hard to imagine what this project is, let alone how it could be translated into other settings. It is intransitive in the sense that it goes nowhere, and no one seems interested in conducting a genealogy of how it got to be the way it is, what the criteria of effectiveness might be, or even what value it performs. Fatima Sintez, it does what it does. I don't want to make too much of this. I don't want to foreclose the possibility of grasping all of the intellectual and effective labor that went into taking massive amounts of material apart under the radar and repiecing the intricate trade-offs, concessions, accommodations, buyouts, let alone the design and materialization of a vast interior space behind the enduring facades of individualized apartment units. Conceivably a vast money laundering project, or equally possible, a strange investment from deep pockets interested in an opaque foothold in potentially turbulent urban districts. Its modus operandi, even if critically important, doesn't address the resultant instantiation of something that rebels against any act of translation. Of course, the materialization of something so hidden is going to be reflected in the economy of how those affiliated with it speak about its purposes and operations. Of course, no one is going to give anything away unless cornered. And it is precisely this complicity of affiliates to carry on with a dissembling of their incapacity, their banal ordinariness as the marginals they are expected to be, that is critical to such rebellion. No one expects this thing to last. It's labor intensive. Things have to be worked at in order to be maintained. There are no apparent corporate bodies, nor democratic deliberations. There indeed may be, but again, this is the maybe of the situation. It's not that the residents here would not want recognition for their efforts, would not want to be seen as worthy of inclusion in a broader effort of city making. It is not that they would refuse a demand for justice, a just accounting of what they have done or could do, of their efforts of being counted for as valuable as those of anyone else. But what they insist upon is that something else must accompany anything they offer as comprehensible and translatable. And that accompaniment is a specificity without bounds, that is not a placeholder or compensation, that is not a culmination or even weak representation of who they are. It and they have simply come to be, at this particular moment, what they are. It's not the only thing, but because this specificity isn't interested in the game of identification or assessment, it will accompany them at every instance of what they are and could become. The prefiguring of abolition, if true to its commitment to changing everything, is in a complicated position. It exists in a time that is not of abolition, but not detached from it either. It also has to be more than transitional. Though it may offer a window onto what we hope might come, what is struggled for, it has to both cover its tracks, throw off the scent, but also surprise and reassure at the same time. In an intellectual era, long dominated by notions of fluid, non-contractual socialities and imminent becomings, of new organicities and ecological resilience, all now frequently reduced to ideology and algorithmic preemption, there is conversely something critical about the construction of a specificity that is only what it is, something that accompanies everything else without comparison, without judgment, that implicitly rebels against its own potential attainments, that can't be pinned down, that won't go away, that is its own black cause and the cause of blackness without punctuation, authority, or end. A specificity that cannot be pinned down or captured. Maybe. So as I end these three lectures in closing, I just want to offer my many thanks and gratitude and support for my colleagues at the Urban Institute. to Simon Marvin, to Aidan Weil, to Beth Perry, to Michele Lancioni, to Vanessa Castambroto, to Jonathan Silver, and to Roland Atkinson. I'm very much grateful for the confidence that was bestowed on me to initiate this Sheffield Urbanism lecture series, and I'm grateful for this opportunity. So thank you very much.